Veronica, welcome to Austin Next.
Thank you, Jason.
I know we've been talking about doing this one for a long time, so it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
All right, so I want to start off with talk to me a bit about First Bight Ventures. What's the thesis of the firm? How do you guys think about what's the fund size? Where are you focused? Check size? All the basics.
Yeah, First Bight Ventures actually, in a snapshot, is we invest in early stage, we call it biomanufacturing companies that have proof of concept, meaning they have the valid science, and we can validate that they have commercial viability. And then we really focus on helping them to scale. That's the stage we invest in their need to go engage in commercialization in terms of de-risking the scaling. And our fund one is about 11 million. We invested about 1 to 1.5 million on the average per company. We're a very concentrated player because we do sit on the boards, we lead, and we try to be very active investors to help companies at this stage to scale. We are planning to launch fund two, and that will be, we're planning to write bigger checks. It's still going to be a concentrated portfolio, and we're going to write bigger checks.
So I noticed when you described the stage, you didn't use kind of like the seed A, B. In something as capital intensive as like biomanufacturing, and when you're at the way you describe it at scale versus commercial, like how are you dealing with like the valley of death? Like they need to actually be validated science, but then you need capital to do that. So where are you, in that almost traditional sense, where are you thinking that fits?
That's a great question because, and what we try to do is really try to be capital efficient to help these guys to validate the key risks that people see as risks when they're scaling so that they can, and also leverage government or non-dilutive funding sources. There has been non-dilutive funding sources, and there's increasing amount of non-dilutive funding sources to help with the different capital stack. When you talk about the capex that needs to be invested, if you're able to de-risk the technology and have the right commercial partners, for instance, one of our companies like Vicilis just recently announced a partnership with Xi'an, the corporate, which is a large isoprene provider, to do a production facility jointly pursue. And obviously, Xi'an is much more bankable than a startup. So when you partner with the right commercial strategics, you're much more likely to raise capital in a different way, debt capital, project finance capital, and you also have the expertise and credibility to know, to the market saying, we know what we need to, what that manufacturing process is going to be, what that plant is going to look like, and we have customers.
So we should probably take a step back and up a level. How are you thinking about, biomanufacturing, industrial, about like what is your definition of it? Is it merely just the creation, and as we think about like, the tools of this, or is it a lot more in the stack?
Yeah, so the industrial biomanufacturing, actually, in general, one of the things, it's one of the interesting areas of biomanufacturing. We're really talking about addressing the $6 trillion market, which is a chemical market. And
just that tiny
obviously,
little one,
I know, tiny little one, exactly. But it's and to your point, it's actually very much underappreciated. We touch chemical every day in our life, but very few people understand that market because
the vibes are with reindustrialization and manufacturing right now. So you're
true.
in the vibes right now.
That is true. And most of that chemical manufacturing, traditionally, the feedstock has come from petroleum, and the transition that we are for industrial biomanufacturing is really transitioning that into bio-based chemicals. And the advantage, if we were able to get to cost parity, of course, that's a huge if. And I think we are seeing, we can talk about a number of forces that's getting us closer to there is really if we can create the benefits of having bio-based chemicals is obviously there are renewable sources. So we're not gonna like petroleum, we're gonna run out at some point. Um, this is not, this is renewable sources. Second, it's non-toxic. And third, a lot of times when now we're hearing it's around the health risk of it is the fact that we have forever chemicals, right, in our system, and these biochemicals are going to be naturally biodegradable. They go back to the environment, and then it's a renewable source, and it's non-toxic. So from that perspective, it really benefits us because we're using them every day from a health perspective, from an environment perspective. And of course, when you talk about reindustrialization of America, this is important. This helps transitioning. In fact, America, speaking about is we have a really interesting opportunity to leapfrog because we have gotten rid of the traditional, a lot of that chemical infrastructure. We can really invest in biomanufacturing and leapfrog the rest of the world and be leaders in biochemical manufacturing.
So, a couple of questions here. In this, first, how much of it is, since they're bio based and living organism derived, right? A lot of these are
Mhm.
probably either bacterial engines. How much are we able to lean into optimization? So when we think about, you started off with like it's replace, we're going to replace X with Y, but
Mhm.
then where do we go with the ability to make these even better? And then you asked them the question that where we saw the chemical industry, and I know there's a lot of tension right now with, say, like dyes in food and etc., where you can ask that question of naturally occurring, but optimized is not naturally occurring. But then, of course, there's value to. There's a reason we optimize things, right? There's a reason we're
Mhm.
making these chemicals better, and so how are we thinking about one? What's the potential, and then how do we think about where that kind of the narrative and story that we're talking about, the chemicals versus the bioproducts, where does that kind of line get blurry?
Yeah, so you can think of it. I think of it as any technology adoption, right? Think about the Walkman versus the from to the CD player, a portable Walkman from tape cassette tape to CD player, right? So when you're looking
There's going to be
at
some Gen Zs who are
any,
listening and going, "What's a
I know.
Walkman?"
That's true. When you think about these technology transitions, it happens with, first of all, you're kind of replacing a need or you're seeing a need, right? And one of the things, it's a lot easier, instead of spending a lot of money educating when you're introducing a new product, you have to educate consumer and you have to create there's a lot of supply chain complexity in the manufacturing process. So when you're trying to introduce novel attributes, it is actually a much longer process in terms of development, R&D, all of that. And this is one of the reasons that it is our belief at First Bight that we focus on drop-in chemicals first, because
Mhm.
these are products that people are already using. Just by making, if we can make it at cost parity, same price, same molecule. So we are not taking product market risk. Everybody understands how to take that molecule, go incorporate it into their downstream other products. But it is made better and is biochemicals, which are biodegradable. It's a non-toxic process. That itself has incredible demand because I think consumers are already clamoring for it, but right now it costs so much more that it's very difficult for people to actually afford it. Affordability has been a key issue. But if we can make it exactly at the same cost, I think that is an inflection point when everybody will switch. And cost has always been a driving factor for most technology adoptions, if you look at that.
So, from your perspective, is the molecules themselves, is that the biggest value driver? Is it the technology stack, the way that, thinking back to like, Elon's famous quote, like the factory is the product. Where is it? Where are you investing? I'm guessing it's more than one piece in that stack. And then how are you thinking about the maturity of each of those pieces?
That's a pretty good question. So there is definitely, I always think there's probably four stages of that process. There's a discovery phase, which a lot of time is research, fundamental research that happens in universities a lot of times, and they get grants or there's other opportunities where they're just starting to understand the molecules and the biology of the organism. Can they do it? They're validating a lot of those basic mechanisms. And then you have, once they identify something, now there's we need to kind of start to identify whether there is a problem that we're trying to solve, or are we solving for the right problems, and then can we actually look at commercializing? Is there a customer? Is there people who actually want this product? This is kind of the early seed stage. And that actually involves both there are two steps in that second stage, which is one is the upstream biology part. And that's one of the things we are noticing is people are forgetting that second step is there's the chemistry purification part, right? So this is actually a multidisciplinary because in order to get to the molecule of interest, it's not just the fact that we have a broth that has the molecule of interest, is we actually have a way to purify it to get to the product of interest. And that process needs to be cost efficient. So there's a whole technical economic analysis to understand whether you have a commercially viable technology. Then from there, you get to now scaling it in terms of manufacturing. To your point, now we're talking about, and this is another, I would say, step three, another stage that we also get very involved. We're starting with, that's one of the reasons we'll talk about an accelerator that we've started to help de-risk that, because you can't go from lab scale milligrams to millions of tons either. So there's an intermediate step as you scale to use pilot production to de-risk your manufacturing process in order to, before you get to just like cars or whatever, they all need prototypes, right? And then to validate manufacturability. So there is a step in that as you scale the manufacturing of it. And then finally, it's kind of once you got all of that, then you got your supply chain, now you're really kind of bringing it into different products and applications. Now you have different specifications. A molecule like polyurethane can go into many, many products, right? It can.
But I'm thinking more from the technological innovation itself in those stacks. And I mean, you think about like the pharmaceutical industry in many ways has outsourced like the industrialization of biomanufacturing is not done by the pharma companies, right? They outsource it to CDMOs and the like, versus in the chemical industry, and I am not an expert, so I may have this completely wrong. A lot more of that, since obviously a lot of that is more about refinement rather than the R&D and creation. There you have those innovation is in that part of the stack. And so what I'm curious about is, are we seeing, based on what your description there, it sounds like it's a lot more closer to almost the pharma industry, but more vertically integrated, where you are building it out. But is there innovation that we are seeing in the actual, you having industrial biomanufacturers who aren't creating the chemicals? Are we seeing those parts of the stacks? We're seeing innovation there, like the equivalent of CDMOs, or the equivalent of, hey, we want to create a better way. As I kind of see that what's happening in the industrial manufacturing sector in general, like Hadrian and
Yeah.
like those kinds of companies that are maybe needed in this space as well, so that you can actually catalyze the people trying to create the new, the chemicals that are replace petroleum based, as an example.
Yeah. So I think ultimately chemicals, industrial chemicals is very different from pharma in the sense of industrial chemicals have much lower margin. Therefore, operating, so manufacturing costs and the efficiency that you can extract from manufacturing is actually critical to profit margin. So this is why I think this industry is very different where you actually want to own, so your CapEx is your boat. And
Mm-hmm.
if you're able to actually build the operational know-how, the trade secrets of actually making it and locking in suppliers at efficiency is part of your competitive advantage, right? So it's similar in that sense. It's very similar to semiconductors, right? You're seeing that scale, that manufacturing capability and operational capability becomes very difficult to replicate. And
But you do have the
so
split though in semiconductors between the fabless and
yeah, yeah.
fabs,
So
right? So,
ultimately, I think there is, to your point, there is an infrastructure potentially play.
hmm.
And I think there is a research report that BCG and Synonym came out that demonstrated that in biomanufacturing, about 85 to 90% of the infrastructure is actually non-molecule specific, right? And so that does create a potential opportunity once as this industry scales, just like cloud data center, right? As cloud gains adoption, you need to build more and more data centers. And this is the same thing. If biochemical becomes the mainstream product, then these infrastructures for fermentation and biochemical production becomes potentially that one of the things that people will replicate. And this is an infrastructure opportunity for a lot of people in the long run.
So we can have a TSMC or AWS for industrial bio.
Absolutely.
And is that, when I look at, so those two examples, and I read some of the history of TSMC, but not enough. I mean, is that a venture backable? I mean, you think about like cloud, like AWS, Azure, or they all came out of large corporates. Does it require, especially given now we're seeing some of those massive data centers, right, that are being built,
Yeah.
like Stargate, here in Texas, like, does it require something of that nature and that type of, does it require an Oracle? No, that's probably, of industrial bio. I don't know who the equivalent is in industry, in manufacturing, to be the one to say, yeah, we're going to build it. Or is it TMC say like, hey, we can build fabs for semiconductors. We can do this for this, or is it Exxon, right? Like, what does it require on that kind of infrastructure side?
I think it's more likely to be a combination of partnerships because one of the things with incumbents, what they're not good at is innovation.
Oh God, no.
So, right. So, and they're very slow. And in fact, this is part of the reason why this industry is taking a long time, despite, consumer wanted this a long time ago. And this industry continues to be slowly adopting or getting to sort of viable products, or because this does require new infrastructure, and they have the old capex that they have already fully depreciated to produce, so they have the margins, and they don't want to put it in. So that transition, when that paradigm shift happens, a lot of the large companies are not willing to do it. This is why Kodak, despite the fact that they invented digital photography, lost on the war of digital cameras, right? And digital
Google invented the
photography.
GPT and is now
Yeah,
having all the issues with search, right? Like that's
yeah,
such a classic,
exactly.
Clayton Christensen case.
Yeah, because it's such a long time, and people forget how when, Moore's law, we talk about Moore's law and semiconductor, and in your last, uh, I think one of the episodes I heard, people forget after 20 years, Moore's law becomes dramatic, right? But initially they look too small and too slow. And again, it comes back to corporations looking short term. And and this creates an opportunity for actually startups and investors to look at niche applications to start using these biochemicals where the chemicals are still make sense to produce at a smaller volume. And the other thing, so this actually creates an opportunity potentially for innovators with capital that understands that and appreciate that to, and then a partnership, a joint venture with, there are some strategic companies who are actually interested, like Japanese and Korean manufacturers, I think chemical manufacturers, because they domestically don't have a lot of resources. And having renewable resources as a way to produce the chemical is interesting for them, and it could be, and also specialty chemical players who might be interested in higher value chemical molecules for their own business. So start not with the large guys, start with the medium, smaller guys might be a better way to partner. And they have the operating know-how, they have the manufacturing know-how with these startups, and it could help them to differentiate. And eventually the landscape could change, right? So that's kind of how we think about how that industry over a long period of time could shift, um, in terms of if the innovators are partnering with the second tier or middle market players who want to specialize and differentiate.
So your point about like when we see like exponential curves, when you look at them in the beginning, they look small, right? And then as time goes on, it very quickly goes. We've been down this road with like synthetic, bio-based fuels before, and we can point to all the corpses of companies. Is it technology that has shifted? Is it like what's happened? Why would you say now is different than whatever 15 years ago? Not the right timing, but that why those didn't work. We were talking relatively. I don't know if we're thinking when you're thinking about those early moves. Is it fuel? Is it like, or is it a different market? Why is it now that we can make this work versus then it didn't?
I think there's a combination of factors, and certainly First Bight take a very different view in terms of where as well. So, like I said, first of all, we focus on dropping chemicals. People get very excited with novel attributes, and they want to do novel products. They don't realize how difficult it is to commercialize a novel molecule
Mm-hmm.
from a supply chain perspective, get it into products, right? So, get consumer, you have to actually marketing, branding, all of that effort to go to market with a new product. So in a way, we're very contrarian. We're focused on dropping chemicals. The second thing is, to your point, I do think, and this is general market, I think that the reason timing is better is with the continued advancement of computing and AI, which is a huge topic, we are seeing the speed at which we're discovering new molecules, new organisms and capabilities, and the speed at which we can iterate the research and identify novel pathways, and the cost has come down tremendously. And I think going back to that Moore's law, in fact, when you look at biological sort of sequencing a genome, cost of sequencing has dropped faster than even Moore's law in the
Right.
last 20 years, right? So because it's a almost like exponential factor, because the AI helps to accelerate and drive that cost down, right? So it as well as we accumulated more knowledge, so that cost continues to come down, and as we can continue to ride that AI and computing curve, it's going to go down even more. The So that means, and then like I said, the other thing that we focus on, certainly at First Bight, that's different, is we focus on, in the short run, we look at these organisms where they have a pathway to fuel. To your point, one of the reasons that fuel didn't work is it is so cheap. You have to get to such large size and such cost efficiency, which biology just certainly right now isn't there yet. And that's just a difficult challenge. You kind of created the most challenging environment. Ultimately, we can maybe get there. It may take 20 years, right? So what we focus on, like I said, is specialty chemicals that has margins. They're smaller in volume, so you can actually build a pilot facility and actually de-risk and get to profitability,
Can you
right?
give me an
That's the most
example what you
important.
mean? What you mean by then a specialty chemical?
So for instance, one of we talked about one of my invested companies, Vicilis. They have a pathway to take um, sugar, right, and produce a intermediate molecule, which is the mevalonate molecule, mevalonic acid. And from there, you can do different downstreams to different products. So it's almost like you can sort of think of it as a platform molecule. And
Hmm.
from this molecule, you can get to different products. One of the product could be fuel, but we don't have to go there now. Immediately, they have a solvent that's very, very highly valued, and it is non-toxic, and it's just as good as the existing solvent that's toxic. And in fact, the existing solvent that is toxic has already been banned, and their solvent is just as good, and it's completely non-toxic. So now that's a product that sells for tens of thousands of dollars per ton versus something that sells for a lot less, right? And they also have isoprene, which is another. It's not a high margin, but it's a mid tier molecule, which is used in rubber, right? I have another company that actually has a way to get to bio-based isocyanate, which is also paid a very high value molecule, right? So these are companies that's coming up with these, I would call it sort of platform molecules that can get to high value molecules and that we can prove their path and profitability by and technology that way and partnering with people who are interested in that. And as they this is a long term, as they validate that and prove a viable business for that, they can continue to improve that eventually to get to fuel. But we don't have to solve that problem now. And the immediate commercialization, because companies are going to take time to grow, right? They don't have to go all be that big company. This is different from the part that is most different from this from traditional software is you can't just scale those people and more code. You have to scale the factory and the supply chain and all of that complexity with it. So the more that you focus on the economics of and validating that technology at a smaller scale, it allows you to de-risk as you scale.
So it's a great point in that the most times like the software can exist essentially in a vacuum, right? I mean, obviously, if you have an app, you need the app store, like, but roughly it can be I can create it and sell it to you, and I don't have to worry about the surround and
Correct.
infrastructure. But as you said, like if I'm creating, you know, in the physical world, in something that needs manufacturing, there are all of these other things, the supply chain, the physical infrastructure that I can lean into until I'm on the pilot scale, until I'm building out, my own manufacturing. That is, it was like you don't. Sometimes I don't even realize how expensive that is. I just remember when Anduril
Yes.
announced, their Arsenal One in Ohio. They're like, yeah, and it's going to be, it's $900 million we're putting into this. Like, oh yeah, these aren't cheap. This is why a lot of these, larger defense companies are raising so much cash because they have to make their gigafactory. And so, how do you see that surround and that ecosystem? And is it really a chicken and the egg problem? Because the the companies need the surround, but then that ecosystem doesn't exist. Like, I'm not going to build these things until the
Mm,
companies exist. Like, how do you solve this? It's its own kind of cold start problem.
yeah. And that's a great question. And one of the things we have been seeing the US government is starting to recognize this as an issue, right? And the most recent report that we talked about, the National Security for Emerging Biotechnology and the National Security Commission just published a report and that advocate for America and in the US to make investments in infrastructure. As we talked about, 80 to 90% of that infrastructure is actually not molecule specific. So if there is some government funding to help de-risk that first of its kind plant build, I think once the things are proven, private capital can be activated. And as we talked about, if you have the right partners to build that first of its kind, different type of capital also can be activated, like project finance and debt capital. So it doesn't have to be equity. So it can be very equity efficient because all of that infrastructure and equipment, there's equipment leasing, and there's land, there's lots of assets that's being built that you can seek alternative financing for that doesn't have to be funded all by equity capital. And if the government is willing to come in and support this infrastructure build out in the initial phase, it will help attract private capital because the projects will seem to more de-risk and create the demand is already there. Now it's a matter of can you actually do it? And if you're proven that you can do it, now capital will flow that way. And in this report that exactly talks about how Chinese government is essentially subsidizing a lot of this for their companies to start gaining in biotechnology in terms of advantage against U.S. companies because the Chinese government is helping to do a lot of this.
So I saw the headline for the report. I haven't had a chance to actually read it. What were like the specific recommendations? Because I always get concerned on the industrial policy specificity when like we should go this way, that way, because obviously the benefit of the US system is the serendipity and the
Yes.
the marketplace of ideas and who knows what we're going to come up with. And then you've also seen when we had some of this before, you had Solyndra, right? Which I don't know how much money went into that. And like,
Yes.
it's not like the U.S. government is not good, venture capitalists. And so
Correct.
the question, but at the same time, when you had like the build out of the national highway system, that's a very positive thing. So it's a question of
Yes.
what are the recommendations and how does it unleash the builders and innovators?
Yes, and in fact, they had, I think there are 5 things that they mentioned that I thought were really good in terms of how to mobilize the private sector. One is to simplify regulation for approval, right? Because right now,
okay, got me on that one. So,
and the second is actually talking about especially this gap, building this pilot, helping to de-risk, scale up manufacturing. The third thing is actually protecting the infrastructure in the sense of I think what they're saying is regulations that helps to not let because right now they are trying to sometimes also come in and they buy like they bought Bayer units of biochemical from Bayer and things like that. So and they will pay 50% more than the market to buy it. Right. And so we need to be, this is what CFIUS role. So being
I was going to say, isn't that what CFIUS is supposed to do now? Is that, or is
yeah,
there...
but there had been less, I think, on some of those. And this is advocating for obviously more protection on those things. And then, of course, counter, and I think we're already seeing the president doing any unfair practices, right, from China. So these are, I would say, these are all interesting things, and this is one of the things that we are doing as well in Houston or in Texas is especially pilot facility infrastructure, because as we talked about, 85 to 90% of that infrastructure is very similar. So really, each time a company in this area, when they need to pilot something, to get to pilot scale before they go to full commercial scale. 80% of that is CapEx is very similar. You can reuse that, but they only need it 6, 12 months and they go on to do their actual, but the next startup can actually use that facility. And so one of the things that we have started is a nonprofit accelerator called BioWell in Houston, and we recently just secured a facility with up to 15,000 liter of fermentation capacity. We're looking in full microbiology labs. So we are looking to partner with companies so we can lease that. To your point, it's almost like a plug and play or some kind of, like a cloud infrastructure. We're starting to build these capabilities so startups can be a lot more capital efficient. They don't have to buy these equipments. They can kind of lease the space, get access to the equipment, do what they need, get the validation. Now they are ready to help them to fundraise for the next phase. The second thing on government support is we
Quick,
have
quick question
seen,
on sorry
sorry,
on bio. Do you see it as something that sits in parallel to the fund? Do you see it something that comes kind of before the fund, after? Like, where do you see it sitting in the life cycle of kind of companies?
for that infrastructure, we actually see it all across, right? In terms of they could come in before the fund, they could come in. Well, for companies we invested in could use that facility in a much more capital efficient way, which is great for equity investors. And we could also help companies outside of the fund. It is a nonprofit, it's independent of First Bight. Obviously, we have an association because we started it, but really it is an independent entity. We're open for helping the whole ecosystem with collaboration with even larger companies, and where we have a few large chemical companies who are interested in biochemical. They're doing experiments, they're running their own process pilots, and they're looking at using that facility for their own process piloting as well, because they don't want to build and run a dedicated pilot facility themselves because they're not going to use it all year long, right? So these are all things that we are starting. I think having that pilot facility could help a spectrum of things, of companies, so they're not exclusive to First Bite companies.
So you're in Houston. You put obviously the BioWell in Houston, and one of the things that I think about a lot is that there are first principles to ecosystems, and I'm going to oversimplify it. And any chemical engineer out there, please give me a little bit of rope. But at its core, I mean, industrial bio is the movement, the creation, and refinement of chemicals. I think that kind of naturally fits with the first principles of Houston.
Yep. No, I would agree. And but I think this, I mean, as obvious as it may seems to you, I think it hasn't been so obvious for most people in this industry. And in fact, when you talk about, one of the questions you asked me is who are the type of founders? They're all biologists most of the time, right? And they figured, and in fact, when you look at the history of the failures, a lot of the failures is they had proven the biology work and they think the chemistry should just work. And guess what? It doesn't, or it does, but it's super expensive. So one of the things, the disconnect we have as we talk to these startups is they realized how much of a gap where the biologists think we're done. We proved we can do it. But the purity level and the effort requires to purify that to get to a product that's commercializable, and the cost of that is actually really critical for it to be commercially viable. And a lot of times they forget that. And the other thing is, of course, supply chains as manufacturing. When you think about your raw material, one of the reason biofuel, as you mentioned, failed is because they use corn, and you're competing with food. So that feedstock is not good, right? In the long run, we can't scale an industry where we're competing with food. So we learned a lot of hard lessons, I would say, in the last 20 years as we tried this. And one of the things I think truly First Bite is, I feel fortunate that we entered the time with, is we know what are hopefully a lot of the pitfalls, and I'm sure there's still more, but 80% of the pitfalls that we should avoid to uh, and help these startups. That's a lot of what we do, is to make sure that they don't go down the wrong rabbit hole.
Well, I think it gets to the fact, and I married a PhD in chemistry, so and I'm on the bio, so I understand that tension. Is I think for so long, and this makes sense, is that biology has been in the production of products is binary. Did it work or did it not work? And back to your point on the, let's just take therapeutics, the margins are so large that you can, okay, just figure out the scale aspect, figure out that, you can figure out how to manufacture it. Uh, and it's back to that question of why now. It is we're now entering the engineered biology era, and so you're starting to have this kind of nice intersection of like thinking about, well, I can tinker. Like it's not just binary. It's like, well, this didn't work. Let me change it a little. Versus, 20 years ago, that wasn't a question you could ever say or something you could ever do, because you're like, I found this molecule. Now I'm going to go test it in 1,000 different ways to see if it actually worked. Or I've got this new, target. Let me go throw, 10,000 or, different molecules at it and hopefully find one that fits. And so you're kind of having this really amazing kind of intersection between that kind of engineering mindset, the biology mindset, and they're the different founders. Right? So when you have this industrial bio mindset, I do think it'd be interesting to see that the future of bio and health and the future of industrial bio, I wouldn't be surprised they start being the same kinds of founders, because they start to look very similar. You engineer these products going up. You have to actually build them. You think about the manufacturing of them, even if they're happening in the, digital or physical space. They just start looking more alike because of the convergence of these two disciplines.
I think early stage, you're correct. You're exactly correct. And this is where, why Sambita said they were in J&J J Labs, right? So they started in J Labs because in the lab part is very similar, but the scaling part is dramatically different. To your point, pharmaceutical, they don't care. They have such high margin. And plus, for them to get to 1,000 liters, that's scale, right? Because that's like, because they don't need to do millions of tons. If they have tons of materials, they're good, because look at how many you use milligrams, right? In terms of treatment. When we talk about industrial chemicals, the margin's not there, and we're talking about, in some cases, like isoprene, it's 800 million ton market annually, right? This is a molecule every day people use. It's in rubber, it's in tires, it's in everything, right? So the massive scale that we need achieved for that is just so different when you think about scaling. That's why I think that's one of the things that's very interesting about me, because I had industrial engineering background. I think that made why it became so like I intrinsically understood the challenge and what you needed to do to overcome that. But a lot of the scientists certainly don't, because they've only worked in the labs, never seen a manufacturing plant. And so it is a very different path in terms of what they would actually do and be willing to do. And so, to your point, I think the way that you would guide and mentor and support the companies is and need the a lot of times in I think in biotech you can stay a scientist um, or be more scientific focused, and then you can sell to the pharma companies. Here, you really have to figure out how you're going to scale, and understand what it takes to scale before you even think about launching an industrial biotech company.
Well, I actually think the manufacturing, on one hand, I think the manufacturing of biopharma products is going to become more important. But to your point, I actually think it's a different question because it's heading in the other direction, which is how do you produce one? Because if I have to produce one drug for one person,
Gotcha.
that's an entirely different manufacturing problem. I am not going to build a plant, in a line for one. So how do I solve that equation? To your point, which is then a very different of I have to do 800,000 tons a year. Like those are they're heading vastly in different opposite directions. But there might be interesting learnings and overlaps and precision. But yeah, how you manufacture is just becoming a bigger and bigger thing that we spent, I don't know, 30 years saying that's somebody else's problem. And then we couldn't manufacture the things we needed.
Yeah, and I like your point. We're going toward more personalized medicine because what realized is um, because we're all different biologically, so the reactions to whatever drug is going to be different. So that's what's really going to be required ultimately. And whereas for industrial chemicals, it I think the chemistry becomes so for I think medical biology becomes more and more important. So the biologists are really interested. For industrial chemicals, to your point, chemistry, chemical engineering becomes more and more important because it is the scaling part and the manufacturing part that becomes really critical that determines commercial viability of that industrial biotech, which is one of the things we're really trying to kind of imbue with our startups and also talk a lot. And we're trying to attract chemical engineers and this is actually an interesting time. I think chemical engineers are interested in biochemistry. It's just there is that tension, like you mentioned. But I think increasingly this is becoming interesting. And the industrial biotech really requires one of the things they're starting to requires chemical engineers to partner with them in order for them to be successful.
So how are you able to start crafting that narrative in Houston and being like, no, actually, we're the the oil and energy industry where it's the same thing. We're talking about one thing. We're not talking about other things. And how much is Sologen helping from a narrative perspective, which is people the audience, like it's one of the few industrial bio unicorns out there, and one of the few ones, and it's in Houston.
Yeah. And in many ways, I have to say, Sologen was my inspiration to come to Houston to begin with.
So
Is
narratively, it's already working.
yeah.
It's creating that gravity,
So yeah,
which you hope, right? When you have that
yeah,
winner.
yeah, and so and certainly Sambita is doing a lot of great to contribute to that as well. And we really feel, as we have BioWell having a real facility, and increasingly, I would say, as I talk to my founders and talk to more people, increasingly, I think that chemical engineering is a critical element to enable industrial biology. That message is getting heard. I really feel more and more people start to understand why chemical engineering, chemical process engineering, and manufacturing is critically important for industrial biotech, and we are seeing much more engagement and appreciation for that. And that's one of the things that I feel fortunate to come to Houston, in the sense of Houston already has that talent base actually, and this is also why I believe Houston fundamentally is the right place to scale this. Um, because you have that natural talent pool that you could tap into. And, it's hard to attract talent from other places. And if you already have intrinsic talent, and one of the things I always say, Silicon Valley is the best place for software because not because it has the best software, engineers in the world, but because it attracts the best software engineers in the world. And one of the things that's natural about Houston is Houston's is already where best chemical engineers go to. So, I don't need to do that work. And if we can partner the right biologists with these chemical engineers, we think we can unlock industrial biology.
So one of the things that I think is really unique about Texas is that the ecosystems actually have a natural connectivity. So while I do think, and we joked about, and I probably will call this episode, I do think that Houston is positioned and will be the industrial biocapital of the world. How do you see like Austin fitting into this equation? Where's that connectivity? Where do you see it helping the sector in Houston or bleeding over? Where do you see that going?
I think actually that's a great question. I think Greater Texas in general has a unique, really real play because you have multiple places, right? You have San Antonio, right? We have, in fact, it's really interesting. Southwest Research Institute is based in San Antonio, and they have an incredible chemical sort of capability, chemical engineering capability, and they're working with a lot of my companies actually as well. So you have capability in San Antonio, and you have Austin has the software, a lot of that software and technology talent. And as we talked about, even as we scale industrial biology, in fact, AI is going to be a critical tool to help both in discovery, but also process management and tracking, manufacturing improvement, efficiency. So there's going to be a lot of software tools to help us to accelerate that cycle to be more efficient, to discover new organisms and improve the process engineering. And then, of course, you have Dallas as well that has a lot of the bio research and as well as Houston, the biotech research capabilities. So I think these cities are actually really complementary in terms of industrial biotech is a much more cross-disciplinary, I would say, space than the traditional pharma, right? We talked about it's more about biology, whereas here the chemical engineers, the process engineer, and the land and the ability to scale manufacturing, is
There's a
all
little bit of land between
integrated.
Austin and Houston that can be used. Yes.
Yes, exactly. So I think Austin can be a great accelerator to help this industrial biotechnology to scale.
So I always ask the same question at the end of every episode, but I'm going to put a slight twist on this one. Um, so, what's next for Austin and Houston together?
I would love, I mean, there are personally, I think I would like to see three things, right? One is I would like to see when Austin, at the end of the day, just it's where our capital for Texas is. So I would love to see more um, people in Austin, certainly the Congress and the government recognize this is a huge opportunity for Texas. Texas also has a lot of potential feedstock, by the way. We have a lot of wood pulp on the west side of Texas, and we have lots of corn. So there's definitely an agriculture. We have a lot of agriculture and a lot of agriculture waste that we can actually use as renewable feedstock, right? So as a strategic thing for Texas, I think industrial biotech could be an interesting thing. And the more Austin people understands it and start to recognize what regulatory or from a legislative to help enable that is really would be very, very helpful. The second thing, as I mentioned, is this collaboration between there is no hard tech that doesn't require software or technology or computers anymore, right? Computers isn't everything. So how do we apply the latest technology to help enable even more accelerated development for industrial biotech? We talked about how technology has been a key enabler in terms of driving costs down for industrial biology. And this will continue, and there is a natural, I would say, marriage in terms of how these could come together in terms of talent and integration of tools that can be developed to enable more efficient industrial biomanufacturing. That would be very, very helpful. And the last thing I would just say is I mean, this is something I know it's starting to, but maybe I don't see as it would be helpful to do even more, create sort of this consortium around, maybe a Texas consortium. Doesn't have to be, a Houston, Austin thing, but can be a Texas consortium because we can leverage San Antonio and Dallas to create a consortium around biomanufacturing and making this really kind of claim a stake, put a stake on the ground and say this is an area that Texas wants to own and lead, because we definitely have the Midwest states are trying to get, because they have the feedstock and they have ethanol capabilities. But I think from an industrialization perspective, Texas really has the advantage. And if we can create a hub, if you will, that makes this one of those things that we want to be leading the country on, I think Texas has potentially this unique capability to do that.
J&J's looking for 3 biomanufacturing sites. Eli Lilly's looking for 4. If we don't win 1 or 2 of those, it's not good. I've been yelling from the rooftops. We better be winning those.
Yes. I think if we should be, this should be something that Texas overall should create a consortium around and say, we're going to own biomanufacturing, and we really have all the ripe conditions to do it. We just need to put our concerted effort. I think one of the things also, both we're blessed and cursed in that Texas has so much that maybe there's so much we could do, and so we lose focus, right? And as a startup, I know you talk to startups, focus is really important to be successful. So picking which one that you can naturally own, and I really think biomanufacturing is one of those areas that's going to emerge. It's, to your point, the hard thing is it's small now, and it feels like, we're still early in that curve, but really we're not. It's been 20, 30 years. We are right in front of the inflection point now. And if we can focus on it, we can capture and ride with this next wave.
I'm with you. The people in the know realize we're not early. We're actually quite big and hitting it, and it's great. Veronica, love it. Thank you for joining the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So what's next, Austin? We're glad you've joined us on this journey. Please subscribe at your favorite podcast catcher, leave us a review, and let your colleagues know about us. This will help us grow the podcast and continue bringing you unique interviews and insights. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.